Hey everyone, this week I gave a presentation at the Nevada State Council on Problem Gambling's conference about my gambling addiction story alongside Dr. Ken Martz, who focused on kind of backing me up with clinical references and explaining what was going on in my brain during the time that I was getting addicted to gambling and then recovering. This video is a bit long, but if you stick with me, you will learn a ton about what goes on in the mind of a problem gambler. So I hope that you enjoy the presentation, and if you do, make sure that you smash that subscribe button so that we can keep living happy and healthy lives, avoiding the mistakes that I was making for years. Anyways, enjoy the show. Hi everybody, let's start with the elephant in the room. You're probably wondering who's this young, handsome, well-dressed gentleman. His name is Dr. Ken Martz. My name is Rob. And today we're going to be talking about my story of gambling addiction and my subsequent recovery. And Dr. Martz is going to be providing a clinical overview along the way to make sure that I'm not just full of crap. So, with that being said, let's begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back after lunch. I always joke about it that I always get stuck right after lunch, which I assume is a compliment, that people think that I can keep people awake in the afternoon, after lunch snooze time. So we'll see how well that goes. We're gonna play a little bit, talking about how to breaking that cycle. You know, one of the things that keeps coming up that I see all the time is that it really matters who you're talking to and at what stage and when and where and how. So it's nice to think about myself as a psychologist, but it's also got to remember there's prevention in the world, there's recovery in the world, there's lived experiences, and where sometimes the advertising that we might have as a good slogan for one thing may not be as good a slogan for other people at other stages in the cycle. And sometimes, especially legislators, I've found, do not understand the full cycle, so the implications of what sounds good to them being pitched there doesn't always get translated to what's helpful for the field. So a few things to kind of really get to. We are going to take a little bit of goals, identifying the key risk factors contributing to the development of gambling, evidence-based research and personal narrative. Wait a minute, I thought I was going to not put you to sleep with talking about research right after lunch. How do we do this? We will analyze the effectiveness of various coping mechanisms in managing gambling disorder, effective efficacy of different treatment approaches for gambling, and knowledge from personal stories on scientific insights. How do we have a holistic view? How do we begin to think about practice to science and how these collaborate? Because it is a collaboration. And this is one of the things I always talk about, that it's about the relationship, about the relationship, about the relationship. And the treatment doesn't start to happen until you have the relationship. And so how do we get into those relationships?
Me?
Yep.
So everyone, my name is Rob Minnick. I've mentioned before, probably 3 times by now. Let me just start off by saying I started gambling when I was 18 years old. I started with daily fantasy sports. I grew up near the Philadelphia area, and we love our teams there. I've heard a lot of talk about the Golden Knights, but not nearly as much as I would have heard about the Flyers or the Phillies had this been in Philadelphia. Every family event, Sunday mornings, we wake up, it'd be great because everyone's coming over to the 1 o'clock Eagles game. When my friends wanted to hang out with me, we wait until 7, because that's when the Sixers game tipped off. Constantly, from when I was born until now, family events, friendship events were centered around the game. The game took precedent over everything, and that was fine. That's how it was. That was normal. When I found out that I could make money on this game that I love to watch, oh, it's too good to be true. It was literally too good to be true. Over the next 6 years, I would find myself on a spiral, a cycle rather, of having wins followed by losses, never being satisfied enough. And 6 times over 6 years did I work 2 jobs to cover debts made from gambling on sports, slot machines, casino games, and pretty much everything that you could imagine, except Keno. Never understood that one. Now, what I really lacked in my early stages of recovery, which we're going to be diving into the stages of recovery later in this presentation, was I lacked meaning, purpose. When you measure the success of your life by the number of days not doing something, it gets a little bit tedious and repetitive. Say you've never smoked a cigarette before. Are you going to say, well, I've been alive for 40 years, so that's 40 years without smoking a cigarette? No, it's not logical, but that's how I was tracking my time clean from gambling. The longer I stayed away, the better my life was supposed to be. But I was kind of stuck because I got all this thrill and excitement from gambling, and now I have nothing. I was working a job that I didn't like, didn't hate, was living with friends that I liked, but doing things that were pretty standard, pretty normal, pretty boring. And I realized after a relapse where at a casino I spent 12 hours gambling and put myself into debt for 6 months, working 70 hours a week to pay it off. Gambling kind of sucked for me. And this is how it's going to keep going. This idea that I went from doing damage in 2 months to 2 weeks to 2 hours. What was going to be next? One spin and it would cost me my entire savings again. I realized I needed to change, and that's what led to me sharing my story online. And those videos sucked. They were bad videos. No one watched them. So my girlfriend said, "Your videos suck. Why don't you make them more exciting? Go on TikTok." I said, "What's TikTok? Isn't that an app where people do a bunch of dances and they just follow trends?" Well, I put it on TikTok, and a video that I shot in the company Donuts drive-thru got 1.2 million views. And I thought, oh, I could do this again. So from then till now, I posted every single day. In fact, during lunch break, I was feverishly typing to make sure I didn't miss my daily afternoon post. And now I reach an audience of between 15 and 20 million people every month. I don't have that many followers, though I would be proud to one day get to that point. But the reach is there, and there are people willing to listen, just like you're listening right now. Thank you all for hearing my story to start.
Thank you. I'm going to hear some themes that start emerging. Interesting. So I got to pick on one thing you said in there about meaning. That might be a word we hear again before we're through, because it's such a critical element. And what the lesson we heard this morning about how we're different than drug and alcohol. Drug and alcohol is struggling with some of the same issues right now. They're having metrics that are about, I didn't relapse for 3 days after I came out of an overdose. It's like, that's not where we're trying to get to. That's a great interim marker, interim metrics, and get them all into research. But it's not talking about research. It's not about meaning. It's not about how do I get my life back. Oh, recovery. I'll talk about that later. Understanding the overview. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding the general cycle, predisposing vulnerability factors from social to fun problems, making the change, and then this long-term recovery thing. What happens after I stop gambling or make a change or develop meaning or whatever that thing means. So beginning to understand that gambling cycle, always have a question. I actually work and do this with most of my clients at some point, and actually sometimes even twice, because when I do this again, when they come back for a family session, I'm not going to invite you to do this right now. You're welcome to think it through for a second. Why did you start gambling? What caused this for you? And they will usually come up with a couple of answers right off the top of their heads, and we start to play Family Feud at a certain point. It's like you see there's a lot of spaces there where they're not filling things in, and it's like, this is why I often start with this, because it quickly identifies what your knowledge gaps are about what some of the causes of gambling are. Okay, so people will come up with a couple of things right away, and what will they be? And we have to figure some of that out. We might come back and talk about that. There are multiple, think about the biopsychosocial model, there are always multiple causes, one of which will be biology. There will also be relationships, the relationship with myself, and for some, conversations about spirituality or meaning and value. So different ways that these all pieces work together.
Well, Dr. Ken, yes, feel free to ask me since I'm here. If you want to know.
Go for it. Why did you start?
Why did I start gambling? It was kind of just to do something with my friends that I always loved to do, which was watching the games, and now I could kind of make it more exciting, more thrilling, because it was like I was playing the game, I was in the game. I played soccer, but I wasn't that good. So when I realized that, hey, I'm not going to be a professional soccer player, my one chance to get involved in my head with the professional leagues and to be really deeply involved was to put money in. Like I had some skin in the game. And so I had this idea that I could win money, I could have fun with my friends, and that would be exciting. And then eventually, that's where I found my meaning from. I'm going to keep that into it.
Meaning? Oh my gosh, we keep going back to that. It must be in there somewhere. Love it.
I sure go for this.
Very good. So we've already seen this morning, so I'm not going to bore you with the conversation of the Custer V chart, but the element that's so relevant through all these years is begin to get the construct that it doesn't start on day one, gambling intensively. Maybe for one or two folks, but by and large, you maybe begin a little social, develops a little more, then my friends say, why are you still gambling? I start isolating, it goes down a process. And the further I go down that process, the further I might need some different things. And so in one of my versions of this, we begin to overlay this with a conversation about what are the treatment approaches that are needed. And so, for example, for people who are up at the very, very top here, we're talking about primary prevention. These are not folks who have gambled ever, and we're trying to adapt and to create the skills so that they never develop a gambling problem. This is often done in schools. In Pennsylvania, we have a pretty strong K through 12 primary education prevention program going on. So making sure that everybody gets stuff, at least in drug and alcohol, and they usually wrap in the gambling with it. Before somebody gets down to a more severe level where they might need more intensive treatment. You know, when I'm dealing with suicidality, that's not the place for primary prevention. Okay? So how do we begin to identify what's the level of service need, what's the intensity, the duration, in order to get to these eventual goals? So, oh my gosh, we start into the research. What works for whom? So there may be different things that work for individuals at different stages. And so if you have the non-problem gambler, we might start with some simple financial limit setting. We might move towards gambling disorder, accepting the gambling needs to change, or reminding yourself of the negative consequences versus effective for everybody, treating the psychosocial distress, alcohol use if present, and the impulsivity. So whether it's prevention or across the spectrum, they seem to find some different benefits there. One of the things we also know is that age matters. The age of first bet seems to matter. Same thing with drug and alcohol. The average age of first bet, the average age of drug and alcohol is 12 years old. The lower the risk of gambling severity and the use of other substances and crimes. So the younger you start, the worse off individuals are.
You know, Dr. Ken, alongside that, I said my first bet was when I was 18, but I actually would think back to when I was a lot younger. And I was never okay with losing. Like, whenever I play a game outside with my friends and family, like, say I was playing wiffle ball with my brother, if I was losing, I was changing the rules. There was 4 outs in the inning, and I was set free. So maybe my first bet wasn't necessarily involving money. Maybe it was this inability to accept losses, and that could go back to when I was 8, 9, 10 years old.
And think about it for a moment. No one here, of course, but some folks used to put things like lottery tickets in the stockings. So even at very young ages, kids would get, and we'd open up the Christmas presents, and the first thing we're doing is doing scratch-offs. Oh, you got that? Who got that? Right? So at early ages, how do we begin to think about these things? Right. So gambling disorder has a high comorbidity with the risks of suicidal ideation. It is a little bit more common with the female gender, and it particularly increases with severity of the gambling. So one of the things we can't miss, financial problems is also associated with this. I've often said, by the time they come in to see me, sometimes they have 2 or 3 or 4 times their annual salary in debt. If I stop using heroin today, tomorrow I can start building my life in recovery. If I stop gambling today, and I have 3 times my annual salary in debt, I can't see beyond that. So there's a sense of hopelessness that creates that risk of suicidality that is challenging for us in our field in particular. So a bit on predisposing vulnerabilities. How do we begin to think early on? I promise I'm not going to make the research slides glaze over, but we're going to mention there's a genetic factor. And it is associated with the D2 receptor gene, but that is, for those that know, that is the dopamine receptors, and which is also why certain medications which affect dopamine also create some risks for gambling. That's actually on some of the warning labels of the medications. There can be other early environmental issues such as trauma, adverse childhood experiences. We know have had some experiences. There's also the issue of the big win. And in another talk when I worked on the brain conversations, there is we call it flashbulb memory, where we begin to, if I touch a hot stove, my brain burns that in, so I don't have to touch the hot stove again to realize, no, that's hot, don't ever do that again. Okay? It's called flashbulb memory. Some of us are old enough to remember the cameras that would have a flash, and then you kind of can't see for 2 minutes afterwards. So this is a fast way of learning. It's not just about trauma, it's about anything like that. And so that's one of the things that we think about in terms of the big win, that I actually had a flashbulb memory of the positive experience, that I can learn that now.
Hey, Dr. Ken.
Yes, sir.
I can remember that, like, kind of early on in my gambling, I was, 18 years old, and the jobs that I was working, I was making maybe $8 an hour, scooping ice cream, maybe driving pizza, getting $14, $15 an hour. So my big wins, relative to some people, might not have been that big, but because I started so young, it felt like, winning $100 on an Eagles game was like hitting the Powerball. It felt the same to me. Do you think that if people are starting younger, the relative amounts are causing some distortion in the brain?
Absolutely. So the big win, I don't have the reference here, the big wins are usually talked about as being something like 10% more than what your weekly salary is. So it doesn't have to be huge amounts, but it's enough that you get that, ooh. We've had actually more than one folks that have walked in and said, I won, and it was, relatively a large amount for that individual, and they're like, they gave me this cash, and I went home and I threw it up and laid it all over the bed, and I just rolled it because I was just so excited that I had won. And by today's standards, it's not so much money, but for that individual and what their salary was at that time, because they were young, it was particularly an issue.
That's something that I run into as an issue with my content online, is that I actually never share the dollar amounts with anyone. Because if I do, then someone who's 18 years old that's watching the video might say, oh, he lost so much money. I'm not nearly that bad. I'm miserable, I'm depressed, but I'm not as bad as him, so I can keep going. Maybe it'll turn around for me, and he was a bad gambler. That's another topic that I think we'll dive into later on.
Absolutely. It's all relative. And so thinking about the different audiences, accessibility and availability, increased access has certainly changed things, and we've been hearing that theme across today. No longer there was a time when I was growing up that if I wanted to gamble, I needed to come out to Las Vegas. And that wasn't or do lottery. And that was about it. Now with accessibility, I can't go anywhere without it being attached to my hip. Accessible through my phone. Now kids are getting their phones in their hand at earlier and earlier ages that can do things that we could never do when I was growing up.
And I think you'd be shocked to hear the number of people that gamble in the bathroom. That's something that I did a ton. When I'd go out with friends in college, I'd actually run off to the bathroom at bars. A highly stimulating environment wasn't enough for me still. I still needed to add to it by playing hands of blackjack or betting sports. Hiding in the bathroom out of shame that they're going to think I'm weird for gambling that much.
And now I'll put a challenge here. How many times have you checked your phone so far in this conversation? Maybe not everybody, a couple of people. Right? A couple of you know. Love it, thank you. You got it? How much our phone has become adaptive and functional. It's like, oh, I got a text. I got to make sure it's not my boss. I got to make sure it's not this. Or sometimes my boss is watching and they want a response immediately. Well, we've become responsive to our phones in ways that we didn't have before. Just again, a very high level overview of the predisposing factors. There's psychological factors such as depression and anxiety. When I'm depressed or anxious or lacking in meaning, I might be more apt to look searching for something. Financial pressures such as focus on the finances and getting more and more, as well as the pleasure of that. Peer influence, so it can also, of course, be an issue, and particularly growing up. If my friends are doing it, then that's how I hang out with my friends, and that's how I get started. Even if it's not a problem at that time, it's exposure issues, as well as personality traits. So again, these are predisposing factors. So these things, being impulsive, I can be impulsive 1,000 ways, but these become predisposing factors, or anxiety becomes elements that make me at risk. And so this is where primary prevention comes in.
And Dr. Ken, with the peer influence, it can actually work two ways. It did for me. First, I started because I wanted to do it with my friends. Then I didn't stop because I didn't want my friends to think I was weird. So it's not only getting people to start, it's getting people to continue.
So key element there again about the different timings. So even the similar issues may have different interventions, different meanings at different times in that, I'm just going to call it the V chart for conversation purposes, because where they're at in the practice, in the series of it, makes a difference. I'm gaming with my friends, but then I'm hiding it from them. How do I move through that? So we still have, there's still research going on of the two types, and we already talked about that this morning, so I'm not going to bring that still further. Culture. I do want to spend just a second here. How do we begin to think about culture? And I'll invite you to just consider this as I'm talking through it, where you are at, and what does that mean? Because how does the interaction of my culture, my client's culture, and the competency of these in translating similarities and differences? So, if I was working with one of the individuals that is downstairs in this facility, what does that mean? Do they look like me? Do they not look like me? In what ways? In age, in gender identity, in sexual orientation, race, religion, physical abilities, body weight, language, socioeconomic status. So back to the conversation about, well, to me, a $5,000 loss isn't that much. To me, a $10,000 loss isn't that much. To me, a $20 loss isn't that much. So differences in socioeconomic status. Where am I at as a clinician versus where is my client at? And how do we navigate these differences and understand those differences?
Yeah, I'm really happy that you bring that up, the clinician-client relationship, because when I was first trying to quit gambling, I actually saw a therapist. And the reason that I didn't find it was that effective was because, one, he actually came from Indonesia. And so there was a little bit of a difference in understanding of what the gambling environment looked like. And then I dug a little deeper and I realized he'd never placed a bet. And to me, finding out that as someone that was just seeking help, seeking the first steps, I didn't really want to get the steps, regardless of how educated he was, how knowledgeable and calm he was. I didn't want to get the first step from someone that didn't understand where I was coming from, right? Which is why I'm really proud of everyone that's here, that's coming and getting this knowledge, because when a client comes to you, it's more than just establishing trust, it's establishing authority. They need to know that they're going to be learning something from you, which is exactly what Dr. Ken is doing, and exactly why we wanted to partner up on this.
And it's also, how do you begin to I also worked at the state agency for a number of years, and one of the things that we thought about at the time was, we have a bunch of brand new counselors out there who are drug and alcohol counselors trying to see my very first gambling client. So how do we help them with that? How do we grow that? How do we begin to have these conversations about proper education and mentoring through that process? Because otherwise, they're going to run into the same situation of, can we translate across the cultural divide of substance use disorder versus gambling disorder? How do we begin to translate the cultural divides of various sorts? Even right down to the level of the type of gambling, the pathway to recovery, the length of time in recovery. Have you ever been there where you use marijuana, I use heroin, and there's this competition of the different types of drugs versus the types of gambling versus the how did you stop versus you're in harm reduction versus you're in something else. And does that create different mental images and attitudes of judgments? All right. So just going to skip this, but begin to get the sense of, when you break this down to an individual, here's an individual, where do I match with this individual? And by the way, notice right away, there's so many of these that are unknown. I can't tell from looking at this individual what this individual's religion is, what this individual's physical abilities are necessarily. So how do I begin to think about that in terms of what additional information do I need to learn about the individual sitting in front of me so that I can make sure I'm not inadvertently stepping on a cultural difference, because I don't know. The recovery journey.
Well, that's back to me. And I just remember that when I wrote this slide up, I was in a bad mood. And I was very cynical through my answers, but they are still representative of exactly what happened. So very early in my gambling, my initial thoughts were obviously, oh, this is fun. Why would I do something that wasn't fun, right? I wanted to do more of it. And for me, I wanted to do more of it faster. So I started betting on regular sports, not just fantasy sports. Then I started feeling like, oh, this is moving too slow, this is boring. Let me bet on the half, the quarter, the first pitch. Then eventually that was too slow, so it moved to slot machines. Someone had asked earlier, how many times can a slot machine be spun in a minute? I can tell you it is well above 25 times. And it actually reached the point, which we'll dive into a little bit later, that I can go somewhere and just be listening on my headphones and know what the amount that was won or lost on that spin just based on the sound. That's how deeply addicted I was, because I believe that I could win. I wanted to seek a thrill, but it wasn't something I was conscious of. I was doing it because it was thrilling, but that's what I thought was fun. Anything that wasn't thrilling wasn't fun. Why would I do it? I feel excited, thrilled, and nervous, but rarely in a negative way. was more, this is the best thing ever. This is like jumping off of a plane, except I'm scared of heights. So this is a little bit easier way to get the feeling. Relationships were always good. Growing up, no major problems, but they were starting to become kind of background to me. Girlfriends, friends, they were there. I didn't lose them, but if they had a problem, I didn't care if there was a game on. That was going to be a later conversation. My relationship with myself was undefined. I was 18. It's still barely defined now, but as an 18-year-old, you can't expect it was too deeply defined. Relationship with a higher power was none. I prayed one time in my life, Dr. Ken, and it was the night before my dad's mother passed away when I was a freshman in high school. Never prayed, never went to a church, so I didn't even know who I was talking to. I was convinced that because she passed away, that God could exist. And I held that belief at least until this time.
So begin to notice, this came up also for some of us who were in the other presentation this morning on the app, having a conversation about, at this stage, this individual at the early recoveries, early gambling stage, may not see themselves as a person with a gambling problem. And so if you start walking in saying, oh, you're an addict. No. Much less one of the other words that we've heard today, the other pejorative language. So really moving into how we begin to understand that the different people we're talking to might be at very different stages in the process, and we need to approach them very differently. So what I would do with this person in very early gambling situation would be very different than somebody at another stage. So always think about these contexts. So let's shift from that early prevention, early intervention, towards the social from the social gambling to the problem gambling. So risk factors include a wide range of things, such as behavioral risk factors, including a desensitization to the risk. The more I gamble, the less there's a sense of the risk to it. It just becomes normalized. The ups and downs become normalized because the brain needs to do that in order to stabilize. The escalation of involvement. By the way, that is called tolerance. The next thing, escalation of involvement. So I now need to use higher and higher, either more gambling frequency or higher dollar amounts in order to still get that experience. So tolerance and withdrawal actually starts to play out in a very similar manner. Tolerance and withdrawal, we've got negative consequences begin to be ignored, and there's a financial reinforcement and chasing the losses. Very often it's the issue of, well, I don't have a gambling problem at this point still. I have a money problem. You don't understand. Those people over there, they got plenty of money, so they can get ahead because they can gamble enough. But no, I don't have a gambling problem. I have a money problem. So we're still talking about a denial issue where I don't get to see the impacts. And the cognitive distortions will be tied right in there, as well as emotional vulnerability and social isolation that can start to evolve at this stage, where I may start misappropriating money. I may start doing some different things. I was sitting with a client and he's explaining how he used his credit card, and it was the business credit card, and he put thousands of dollars, and I'll leave the numbers off the business credit card, and we had a conversation about how this was what we call stealing. I said, no, it wasn't stealing. This was my credit card. It was a business credit card. I said, okay. Were you authorized to use this credit card at the casino to gamble? No. So different folks at different stages, at different places, are going to see and feel things very differently. Well, but it was my card. I was authorized to use it. Yeah. It's a family business. So it's really not. It's just a family business, so it's really my money. Did your mom and dad know that you were using the business credit card at the casino for the purposes of gambling? No. Got it? How to begin to break through some of these different stages that people may be at.
Dr. Ken, it reminds me of when I was spending money that I shouldn't have been spending, I actually would think this isn't a good thing. I knew it was a bad thing. I never necessarily stole, but I definitely lied about what I was using money for. But my intention was always to give it back after I won. And then I'd have my own money to go do whatever I wanted with, which would have been more gambling at the time.
Yeah. So it's not stealing, it's just borrowing.
That was my distortion, for sure.
Got it? So, funny, that's on the next slide here. It's borrowing too. So this denial element, there's a wide range of coping skills, one of which is, in this case, distortions in our belief systems, denials, that issue of chasing the losses. Well, I'm a little bit down, so I've got to get a little bit ahead. The blaming of others. It's not my fault, it's so-and-so's fault. If you wouldn't have interrupted me, then I would have won, and then it would have all been okay. You know, if you would have, isolation. If I isolate myself, then I don't have to deal with you judging me, so I will just stay all by myself. Escape. So there could be other addictions, there could be multiple ways to escape. Magical thinking. Well, I wore my lucky socks today, and so obviously now I'm going to win. Because the last time I wore my lucky socks, you know, that's when it did. And the reason I lost this time is because Mom washed my lucky socks, and so they're no longer working anymore. And so, particularly with my sports bettors.
You know what I did? Is I would have this app on my phone to check scores, because sometimes I was betting on tennis matches that weren't on TV. And if it was in my left hand and I saw the opponent scored a point, I switched to my right hand. Because then when I saw that, you know, my team scored a point, I'm like, oh, you know, obviously I knew I wasn't affecting it, but it still was, I was trying to create control in a situation that I had.
And if you think about that from a behavioral reinforcement perspective, I just now got rewarded for having it in my hand and negatively rewarded for it being in the wrong hand. Okay, so you start reinforcing in manners that perpetuate these beliefs. Okay? And forming those brain pathways. Seeking quick fixes, impulsive decision making, and avoidance of treatment. Why would I go to treatment? I don't have a problem here. I don't have a problem here, so I wouldn't need to go to treatment, right?
That's for everyone else.
That's for those people that really have a problem, you know, because they're like homeless and living in the streets. I'm not living in the streets. You know, there's always somebody that's worse. There will always be someone that's worse. Ineffective coping skills. Gambling to escape the stress. So, gambling to escape the stress, you hear where that's going. So now I'm going to gamble, I'm going to lose more money, and I have more stress, not less. That doesn't seem to work.
It never does, no.
It's like an ostrich sticks its head in the sand, and then what happens? It gets kicked. You know, escaping like that, ignore it, and stick my head in the sand, not doing the things, tends to let them progress rather than be changed.
You know, I see it with a lot of people that message me that are sports bettors. They gamble to escape stress, yet at the same time they're gambling with the intention of easing their stress with a fake win. So they're doing more of the same thing, expecting a different result. Someone said that's insane. I'd be obliged to agree that I did it for 6 years.
Well, it's much like, you know, some of our folks also smoke. If you walked to your room, you may have smelled such a thing. Cigarettes, tobacco is a stimulant. So why do I feel like it's calming me? Because you talk to some people who smoke and they say it calms me down. Well, it's calming me because of associations that I have and because of the withdrawal element. I'm feeling anxious about not having it, and so I smoke, which has a slow breathing technique to slow you down. So it feels like it's calming, but it's feeling that it's calming because it made me stressed. So gambling is a stress reliever that creates more stress. Interesting. So this is also the altered stress physiology. See, I told you, you gotta watch me, sometimes a little tricky. I talk about this physiology stuff and I'm trying to put it into English so it like makes sense rather than the D2 receptor gene, you know. So, one of the things I often say is that addictions are a disease of isolation. And for many, many reasons of this, and this is one of the issues that we've had with COVID, and as it quickly moved into isolation. So, you may have heard of a fella, Marlatt. The most effective way to reduce harm associated with use is to prevent the initiation and misuse in the first place. So you may have known Marlatt as one of the leaders in the harm reduction movement, and the best thing we can do is prevention. Always better than going there. Now, the next issues about prevention is the goals of effective prevention are to increase the perception of risk, to increase coping skills, to improve decision-making skills, help our kids, for example, know how to say no, reduce peer support of the gambling behavior, reduce parental support of the gambling behavior. How often, my gosh, the scratch-offs in the stockings. You know, grandma would go play bingo, and I wished her good luck, and so she won. You know, how do you think these things? You go to the track with dad, and that's the time that I spent with dad because I was going out to the track with dad. How many times these associations become supported, either not purposely by parents, but along the way. Delay onset of the negative behavior we talked about, and addressing the risk factors, etc. Now, so the goals of the intervention are to increase the awareness of the harm, increase the perception of risk, and arrest the progression towards causing greater harm. Notice one of the things that's not on here. Fear tactics are not on here. It's not about saying, don't ever gamble because you're going to become something, something, something. Okay? Fear tactics don't seem to work in the prevention side for drug and alcohol or gambling. Actually, if you think about this, some of the issue is we are impulse seeking, we are sensation seeking, we are risk seeking, and if I tell you what the danger spot is, somebody's going to hear, oh, that's what the good stuff is.
And they're going to hear that you're a bad gambler.
Oh yeah, I would never do it his way. I'm better than that. I'm smarter than he is. I would never. Yeah, you got it. So you see the challenges that start to happen. That there's this, especially amongst youth. I would never be like them. There was an old program that used to be Scared Straight. Would take kids into prisons and say, don't use drugs because you'll be like this, and the kids would say, oh, drugs, that's exciting, and actually increase the rates of substance use. I would never do it like that. I wouldn't get caught. I can use some marijuana. I wouldn't get caught. It's okay. I wouldn't be like that. I'm smart. All right, and we're back to average earning.
So during my, we're going to call this rock bottom period, right? The worst gambling, the highest rates of gambling, the highest amounts. These were kind of the thoughts that I was having. This is pretty stressful, but the only way to get out of this situation is to win. Because I'm down, my back's against the wall. If I don't win, how am I going to ever pay this amount back? I don't make this much, even in a year. It seems insurmountable. My beliefs are that I should win, that somehow, some way, the way I did gambling was wrong, that I could improve, I could figure out what I was doing wrong, and use that to gamble better. My values were all about success. I was competition-oriented. If I couldn't win, then nobody could win. I was the exception to the rule, and if I couldn't be the exception to the rule, then, this gambling stuff should be illegal. I'll figure this out. I was scared, anxious, depressed, and very irritable. I had relationships and friendships fall apart because I kind of just snapped at them for no reason. And that's something that we work on in recovery, but we're not quite there yet. Let's see. Oh, this risk taking, absolutely. No regrets was a big one. Becoming very numb to the situation. I can remember sitting up in my kitchen at college, and it was 4 in the morning watching Chinese basketball, and the game ended on some weird play that only a gambler would have ever taken note of. And I saw that I lost all the money that I had, and it was Chinese basketball, and my thought wasn't, my thought was, all right, time to go to bed, because at 10 a.m. tomorrow I'll get up and I'll try again. There was never a point that I was going to admit defeat until I gave up. I didn't lose until I stopped. Kind of like if you look at the stock market and your 401k is down heavy because there's general swings in the market, as long as you're not selling it, it's no problem, right? It's unrealized. That's how I felt about my gambling losses. Relationships were secondary, they were unimportant and deteriorating as a result of the emotions that I was expressing, kind of beginning to isolate and not quite caring as much about people as I used to. I thought I was someone that would take time to volunteer and help people out. I worked with the Ronald McDonald House. Then I started gambling, and I was spending 12 hours a day playing blackjack. That's not helping anyone except maybe the industry. My biology, let's see, I was exhausted. That was a big one. Sleep deprivation went a long way for me. I was tense, stressed, and irritable. My relationship with myself had worsened, and my happiness depended completely on external sources. So whether that was drinking, smoking, or gambling specifically, in my case was where I got the biggest hits of pleasure. If I didn't have these things, life was intolerable. Relationship with a higher power somehow got worse than none. This is where I'm talking that I was writing this pretty cynically, because I don't know how you can be less than none. But everything was pretty hopeless, other than the days that I was winning.
So one of the ways I sometimes see the less than none, because I actually see that show up a bunch of times, there can be a couple of things that start to happen. One can be an anger at God, Because why did you let this happen to me? And obviously God doesn't exist because otherwise this wouldn't have happened. And depending upon what your cultural background was, this higher power thing is like sitting up there on a chair ready to throw a thunderbolt at me. So if I'm starting to judge myself, and I maybe want to run away from something like that, if that's my image of what religion is, about what spirituality is, about what values are, where I'm starting to feel that I'm not matching what my values are internally. That's what judgment is, right?
And yet the only way that you can match those values when you're in the depth of it is thinking that you can get out.
I'm going to escape.
Yeah. Big one.
Interesting. Good. So we begin to change. And so we're doing nice, we're right halfway through and it's got half that side done. I like it. It's just like, so now we're going to make the change. We're going to shift gears a little bit now into how did we get here toward how do we move forward from here. Okay? Like I said, how do we begin to bridge all of these conversations together in one conversation? Oh, we've seen that slide before, haven't we? So we come back to this now, and some of the things that I would say, as we do the family feud of this, is the first thing may be the biology, the genes we talked about, the biochemistry, the brains, the autopilot learning. This is a whole other hour presentation in itself. But beyond that, there is also the issue of our relationship with others. What about that peer pressure, that family, that enabling issue, the bailouts, the lies, the miscommunications, and then what happens with them? They start judging me. You lied. You mean your car broke down again? Whatever else I may have said that I needed the money for.
Groceries. I ate so much groceries.
Oh, yeah, groceries are just so expensive these days,
It's incredible.
Oh my gosh. And of course, you can't say no to your starving child, right? So, groceries. Relationship with myself. So I start developing that shame and guilt and negative beliefs, and even I hate myself. Versus the last but not least, but is the sense of the higher power, which may be a higher power, but it also could be values. That sense of, I mentioned also the sense of anger and shame at God. So, by the way, one of the things that we've seen clinically, that working for years, actually, and I see this both on the drug and alcohol side as well as the gambling side, is that the biology is usually one of the first things that gets addressed. I gotta get you stable. If you're in withdrawal, if you are agitated, we need to stabilize a little bit before I can have a conversation with you. It may be then that I'm going to start to build a positive relationship. So what's the first thing you do? And you're maybe going to a meeting, you're going to a counselor, you're going to somebody other than myself, creating a positive relationship again. So these things actually start to heal in order, down to I then start to believe in myself. And it's not until much later in recovery for many folks, even though in the step tradition it's step one to turn over to higher power, but for many folks we don't actually start to fully understand the spiritual elements until a little bit further into the process when my head starts to clear a little bit. By the way, in folks that I've worked with who have had a longer period of recovery and then had a relapse, I can usually trace them back about 6 months where they started to isolate and lose contact with they stopped going to meetings, they stopped going to their church services, they started losing connection with their values, and when I started losing connection with my values, I started hating myself again. And when I started hating myself again, I started isolating again. So all this started happening, building up. So I also use this sometimes, as I said, at the beginning or different stages of treatment. By the way, depending upon what those causes are, and they are a little bit different for every individual, there will be different solutions. I might have different, depending upon what the individual cocktail or baker's mix for the individual is, there will be different types of interventions and tools that I might want to consider for this in a treatment setting. Okay? And ultimately, if you hadn't caught on from me, I'm not yet to make slides yet. I like a biopsychosocial approach and try to be integrated because you have to match the needs of the individual. I'm a toolbox kind of guy. You got to pull out the tool that's right for you, not just the one that I like. I'll tell you which ones I like and why I like them, but I've got to pull out the right tool for the right person, the right phase of this process. All right. Goal setting. Sounds like that values thing again.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that very often one of the first conversations I have with somebody that are showing up for the purposes of treatment is, what do you want to get out of our treatment time together? And they say, well, I want to stop gambling. I want to stop gambling. That's my goal. And sometimes, as we've heard before today, in a little bit more eloquent way than I'm about to say, I might say, I can't help you with that. But doc, you're the expert in this. What do you mean you can't help me with that? Well, I can't quite get you to stop gambling. It's really difficult to do, actually. Think about that for a second. So we begin a conversation about, why do you want to stop gambling? And what they begin to have a conversation is, well, I want to stop gambling because I want to get my parole officer off of my back. I want my spouse to stop screaming at me. Oh, well then what? Why do you want that? Well, because then I can be happy. I'm skipping ahead quite a bit here. But begin to start to see what's going to happen now. You're engaging them into a vision of a value of something that they want, that they're willing to be motivated for and to move into, rather than, I want to stop gambling. Well, how do I stop gambling? Well, you stop. That's not going to do it, right? Why do you want to stop? Move me. What am I going to do now that my hand is empty? We need to have that further conversation about, what are my values. So one of the challenges that we've got is that we've got these cool things that sometimes our insurance companies tell us, and sometimes our state regulators, that we need to have SMART goals. And when I use SMART goals, they're really good for business, actually. They're very specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And insurance companies can go through and check you off and say, yes, you did this, or no, you did not do that, you didn't meet them, they didn't make proper progress, so we're not going to pay. Ooh. SMART goals. Now, SMART goal number 1, show up and sit in group. Read page 1 through 3 of the big book. It's a SMART goal. It's clear, it's measurable, objective. It's not very motivating. Not going to make me want to be there much longer, and you see what starts to happen. This is not where I wanted to be. I didn't want to come here and read page 1 through 5 of the big book.
I would feel if you said that to me, that this is just boilerplate stuff that you're telling me, rather than even thinking about the reasons I would leave.
Yeah.
What do you tell someone who wants to quit? Well,
Yeah, and it's cookie cutter. Did I mention again the different toolbox? They're not cookie cutter. Right. So the modern approach here is called BHAGS instead of SMART. It is the big, hairy, audacious goal. What do you really want in your life? And so this is, again, a longer conversation, but how do I begin to identify challenging goals? Well, I want to be free of my debt. I want to be able to be feeling light again and be happy again. Not just happy. Happy is like one of those buzzwords. What does that mean to you? Well, I don't want to be sitting around feeling like that panic moment. I hate that panic moment.
What would you say to someone that doesn't have any goals outside of gambling? Where do we even start to create goals? Because when I think back, at a certain point I was so deep into it that my goal was just to be a professional gambler. That was the only thing I could conceptualize as success. What would you say to me in that kind of spot?
Absolutely. And that is, we heard about motivational interviewing this morning. So there's a whole process and another whole conversation about how to, well, why do you want to stop gambling? Well, why do you want that? Well, what would you mean if you got that? How would that feel? What would you be thinking about if you did that? So notice how the questions are there eliciting you to think through the why upon the why upon the why, and then envision it in a little more, much as we've been doing with the chart before, by the way. What would that look like in your relationships? What would that feel like in emotions? What would that feel like in your belief system change? So you're helping them to create that vision of what something different would look like. And so what does that big goal look like? And these tend to be increasing the motivation and actually increase the readiness for change. They increase the motivation levels. These are things that, I would get out of bed for that. So as professionals, are you going to get up out of bed to say, I got this many hours of things people I got to see today? No. I might, but I'm going to want some coffee. What I do get up out of bed for in the morning is because these are not just people I'm going to see for certain hours of the day. These are lives that are going to change. These are relationships that count on me. I have one mouth and two ears, and by the way, the work that we're having in this conversation, you're going to take that to all the directions of the state and beyond. That's something worth getting up at. You see what I mean about the bigger goal is actually much more motivating. Okay? So there's lots of ways we can do this professionally and personally. So small steps can be easier to achieve, but they may not get that level of progress. So make those little step 1 through 5, page 1 through 5. That's not motivating. And I could have gone a whole lot further. Okay? Very often we all do this. So check this out. That sometimes our challenge is that we set our goals too small. We can actually think a little bit bigger. You want to use approach goals versus avoidance goals. So I want more time with my family versus I want to stop gambling. I want to get the parole officer off my back. They're fine to start, but it's not long term. And use specific practice plans rather than simple intentions. If I have the desire to gamble, I will call my spouse instead. Specific practice plans. So when this, then this. If this, then that. Okay? Notice how much clearer it gets. I have an impulse to gamble. Whenever I have that impulse to gamble, I'm going to take 3 breaths. I'm going to call my sponsor. I'm going to call my spouse. It doesn't matter what the second half of the sentence is. The point is that I'm clear about this is what I'm going to do. We do this all the time with exercise, for example. Well, yeah, it's January 1st. I want to join a gym and get to going regularly. How's that working out for you? You know? Well, I'm joining the gym this morning. I'm going to go 3 times a week at 7 a.m. right before work on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Which of those 2 people are more likely to actually follow through? Specific, clear practices of the steps. And habit forming. Whatever you're desiring here, think about habit forming. I can't just do it once. I need to practice for days, weeks, a couple of months. So start in ways that you're building the practice and practice. This one's going to go quick. There's a lot of words on there, but this one's going to go quick. Remember I said biopsychosocial? If you don't deal with one of these elements that's of concern to the client in front of you, there's going to be a problem. If you don't deal with the emotion, if you don't deal with the trauma, if you don't deal with the relapse prevention issues, the biology, the beliefs, the motivation, the relationships, always want to treat the whole person. They may or may not be ready for the whole person right away. So by timing them, but I'm thinking about all this, whether or not, let's just focus on this one for today.
You don't always think about how important it is, but even just reading this slide, like if I had 7 of these things, but I didn't believe that I could actually follow through on any of them, all 7 would be moot.
Yeah.
So it's really important. Glad you put this in.
I say this all the time, with especially with new clients. I give them my toolbox. I have a client toolbox for my 30 years of practice, and I say, here it is, you have access to it today. Don't go get crazy with it. It's got dozens of tools in there. I want you to go do tool number 4, and that's your homework for this week, that's it. If you read something else, that's fine. But I'm going to limit it down to know that you've got all this possible, envision that there's so much more you can do, and I will give you kind of step at a time so you don't get too overloaded. Yeah, absolutely. And I may still know, I as the clinician may want to still know the big picture, but I am choosing when to have timing for each of these. Okay. And it'll evolve in the conversation. So, one morning I came back after a TV interview, and the client walks in. You did it again. Ken, by last night, you didn't make it 4 minutes without talking about emotions. Sorry, I gotta talk about feelings at some point, and see, isn't this good? I went like a good half an hour before I got to talk feelings about it. I did pretty good. So, but, this is valuable. So, this again, you can spend more time on this, but think about the range of emotions. The emotions are the drivers of the motivation. I can be motivated by my fear. And I'm running away from my debt. I'm running away from being found out. I'm running away from who's going to catch me. I'm running away from the creditor. I'm motivated by my anger. My spouse yelled at me, and so now I'm going to escape to my gambling. Okay? Boredom. This is intolerable. I can't just sit here. What are we going to do? Oh, we go somewhere. We go do something with that. compassion, insensitivity, grief. Oh my gosh, my family member passed away, etc. Okay? So I don't want to feel that. So I'm going to do different things. So very often I will work with folks to help identify, especially guys, because we sometimes need a little more help. So articulating our emotions. So what are you feeling about that? And usually when we start to break this down, they can identify actually a whole rich dimension of the range of emotions. Because the things that I might do with your fear might be a little bit different than I'm going to do with your anger. Might be a little bit different tools than we need to do to work with your grief about what happened and the losses that you had. Okay? So a wide range of emotions are going to really impact that. So we can go around this circle multiple times, but very briefly, the issue again of each one will have its own risk factors. So the fear of getting caught, I mentioned, it's almost like I know this. But the reverse of that is how do I begin to, in the recovery phase now, I'm going from the fear of getting caught to the courage for asking for help. You see what starts to happen. You'll begin to hear, if you think about people that you've worked with, that you can feel a different conversation with folks, okay, about where they're at in the recovery, where you can feel about, no, this one's a little more stable than somebody else. Moving from that helpless or anger at the self-world or others, able to see a vision of the future. That sense of isolation and hungry for pleasure and connection versus able to partner with a provider. That importance of a therapeutic relationship. Whether that's with me as a clinician, whether it's with a peer group, whether it's friends, whether it's something else, someone else. As we were talking yesterday, even right down to parenting, and I'm holding the infant with the phone in the other hand, and I'm not having a relationship here at a very precious time that goes by really fast. So we go through with each of these, and how do I go from, for example, hating myself or shame, grief over losses, versus believing that I am able and worthy of recovery. I'm able and worthy. Each of these would have also different challenges and tasks to process with that. So as you're working through the emotional levels, as you're working through the motivational levels, you might find different tools that will be, did I mention? You might have different tools that you connect with the different emotions, to connect with the different stages of where the client's at, connect with the conversations that they've got. Okay, so it gets more complicated. We've heard today also about the 2 types of gamblers versus the 3 types of gamblers. The more we have, actually we get a little more complex, it gets a little harder. It doesn't fit on a bumper sticker anymore, but that's some of the nuance of progressing as we, one of my colleagues used to say that when I started in my career, I could usually help about 2/3 of the folks, and now that I've gotten a little bit better, I've learned some different skills that I didn't have the access to before, and now I can help about 80% of the folks that I work with. You know? So it's still not perfect, but as we become more diverse in our skill sets and abilities, we can help more people. Because we will ultimately, actually, that's one of the things out there with the research also. Usually the new research or the new medication or the new something comes out, and it's the amazing thing that it helps everybody. And then after the research has been out for about 5 years, it all levels down to about 2/3. And the real issue is about what works for whom, because different things will work for different 2/3. Actually, much like this circle here, if one of these works, that will help about 2/3, which is about half the circle. It will not help for the other side of the circle. Okay? This is a whole master's degree actually in one slide. I always try and translate things into English, try and make them a little simpler, but we can't quite get some things down to a bumper sticker. Okay? Cognitive behavioral therapy, so you have emotions, then you have thoughts. You see what we did there? So we're walking through just a couple of the basics. Cognitive behavioral therapy, I'm not doing a whole cognitive behavioral therapy course right now, but for example, if I have depression, and I have a gambling severity, and there seem to be some gambling-related distortions, if I treat my depression, but I don't treat the gambling-related distortions, what do you think is going to happen? I might still be gambling. So we need to deal with the whole person. If I deal with the gambling-related cognitive distortions, but I don't deal with the depressive thoughts, what do you think is going to happen? I'll stop the gambling, but I'll still be depressed, which becomes a risk factor that I'm going to slip back into the gambling.
Dr. Ken, this is exactly what I ran into when I was doing my early therapy, trying to find my way out before I found support groups. Was, he was like, all right, you're anxious, you're depressed. I'm like, yes, both of these things are true. How can we fix it? The answer was to stop gambling in my case, but we consistently kept looking at the root causes, and it wasn't giving me, I think you call it the biology, the physical space of cooling off enough to even dig deep enough into it. So the order, I think, matters a lot.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the timing, the place, and the making sure that each of the emotions are dealt with, the different beliefs are dealt with. Even with the CBT, if I dealt with your depressive symptoms, but I didn't deal with the anxiety symptoms, you still have an issue there. Right? So if you don't deal with something, it doesn't get dealt with. They found that in one study there was 80% of game-related thoughts were irrational, such as belief in or controlling the outcome. So think about that. Cognitive treatment focused a lot on the illusion of control. There was also a focus on correcting erroneous perception of randomness. And so you might hear about this, particularly when we talk about some of the gambling prevention materials are useful, but they don't quite work the way that prevention works in general. So for example, we're teaching kids to understand randomness, which that's not quite the space that will necessarily make a change as a prevention element. But it's still good, it needs to be talked about, but just understand, as we were just talking about on the slide before, you gotta put the pieces together as well. Understanding the erroneous beliefs and perceptions and getting those. Irrational beliefs. I am not gonna read this list to you, but you know that our folks have specific irrational beliefs, and one of which, of course, is, we've talked about a few of them already, specific to the gambling. I don't have a gambling problem, I have a money problem. Okay? If I don't identify what your beliefs are and help you to articulate them, I'm not going to stop them. We can't articulate and change them. You're going to keep on thinking that. That's going to be the guardrails that you're going to keep thinking. That's going to keep you going down the same track. Okay? So, for example, gambling is a good way to, my gambling is under control. Some things that you've probably heard on a repeated basis. As long as I believe that my gambling is under control, I'm not going to stop doing that, am I? So at some point I've got to identify what their thoughts are and begin to help move them through. One last one on this section is the cognitive therapy has been around for 50 years. It's one of the most widely researched things for approaches for everything out there. It is also a little bit older now. And so the modern version is now third generation. It's called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. So it's simple terms, really combining a bit of a meditative practice along with the cognitive practice. And so it really blends together in a very nice way. Mark Epstein, a psychiatrist who is also a meditation teacher, does a really nice job of talking about my meditation practice helps me to create a safe space so that my client feels safe to talk about the issues that we need to talk about in therapy. My meditation practice helps me to identify my thoughts so that I can discuss those in therapy. Okay? And very often you ask me, what am I thinking? And I'm like, I don't know. What's your irrational thoughts, Ken? I don't know. So, but you begin to have a little more guidance with it, or a little bit of practice of recognizing the thoughts, you can begin to work with that. So it is a growing practice. It helps to improve mood states, anxiety, stress, serenity, abstinence, reduces cravings as well. And it also helps to improve quality of life as well. So it really moves that conversation. It's larger than just putting depression and putting the gambling, but improving the quality of life. And I often say about things, it's like, what if I stopped counting my number of days and started counting how many hugs did I have today? What if I stopped counting how many dollars I lost and started counting who could I give to today? And we're back to the recovery journey.
Dr. Ken, I just want to be mindful of the time. I know that we are running close. Of course, this is going to be kind of the climax that we're going to be getting to, but I think maybe after this slide we should take some questions.
Yep.
Or should we skip to the final slide that kind of sums it all up?
Both together, yeah.
Yep.
Where did the time go?
Time flies.
All right. All right, so last one, long-term recovery, you don't want to miss that. That we begin to think about recovery capital, that we're building a life that's worth living. This is William White, who is a well-known and particularly in the drug and alcohol sphere, taking a look at how to move past that isolation into those connections and hope. These are protective factors. In particular, when I make important decisions, the spirituality does seem to improve the outcomes in the APA. This is a recovery capital scale. The BARC is one that is being used more out there to identify what is my recovery supports. So you see how, again, this is very forward-facing, not about how much am I gambling. Very different kind of construct. That the more protections I've got wrapped around me, the more protected, the safer I am. So recovery is a verb. It's an active state. It moves into integrating all of it. And
now I'll take 2 minutes to just briefly sum up the most influential year of my life. I reached this point where I was becoming more content with my everyday life as I found Gamblers Anonymous meetings specifically and began to work on something that I felt meaning about, which ended up being the content that we're going to be talking about in the next session as well. So I finally feel like I didn't have to win. You know, I had all these losses, but those losses, that money's gone. It's not coming back. And any more money that I risk now is just going to add to the problem. It's not going to fix anything. I found contentment through not this major thrill anymore, but the idea that I don't have to have that major thrill. It doesn't have to control me. It doesn't have to be my life, which led to me being happier. I exercise a little more, do a little better, but not too bad. And I try to keep myself very busy. I found that my relationships now are incredibly honest because when I was gambling, I was a compulsive liar. I lied about things for no reason, but now I don't have a reason to lie. So I try to just keep myself honest and truthful. I've become more energetic and focused. I never would have been able to make it through an hour and 15 minutes of a presentation if I was gambling, that's for sure. I'm honestly much more honest, and I still might not have defined my spirituality and my step forward, but now I have a willingness to try. And with that being said, does anyone have any questions for us?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep. Very, very enjoyable. Great job, guys. I keyed on one thing that you said earlier about, oh, thank you, that we don't always set our goals high enough and we set lower goals. For myself, I have had a tendency to set a lower goal, and when I achieve that, then move on, rather than the fear of failure.
yes.
What do I do?
Absolutely. The first is actually awareness. Just notice by the way this goes across the way here. First is always awareness. I recognize that that's my pattern and I can move beyond it. So are you willing to step out of that, I'm playing it safe, I'm playing small, you know? And then when the answer is yes, actually making those steps. So same thing with clients. It's like, you know, I actually had this conversation with a friend that we kind of poke each other back and forth, motivate each other back and forth of how do I make today's goals big enough to really motivate me and to really focus my attention towards that second half of the lecture, towards those motivational elements rather than just the small steps.
I've been about dreaming big as long as you can't hurt yourself by failing. When I was gambling, my big dreams were a big parliament or a big jackpot. Now my dreams are get 1 million followers, and if I get 100,000, everyone's doing good. So I think my dreams I've changed the avenue by which I'm setting them personally.
Okay. Thank you.
Please.
Hi.
Okay. One and then two.
I've got a question as somebody with lived experience and somebody who works in this space. One of the biggest issues that I tackle is, or try to navigate with people is, they're like, I don't enjoy anything as much as I enjoy gambling. And that for me is the hardest, because by the time I was done with my gambling, I didn't want to do it anymore. You know, I was so beyond it that sometimes when I'm talking to somebody who's like, I love it so much, how can I leave it behind? But it's causing me so much harm, and that's one of the things sometimes I have the hardest time navigating with somebody is really helping them understand that trying to navigate those feelings, find something else that they're more passionate about. Like, are there tools that have been helpful for you in this process of setting higher goals, setting different things to kind of bring back some passion in other ways? ways instead of, always trying to compare everything to the field of gambling. Did I make that a clear question?
Yes, absolutely. In the 2-minute version, I'm happy to have this as the longer conversation. In the 2-minute version, there's one of the ones I skipped over just because this wasn't the treatment training. Would be, and one of my favorites is NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, super short version of it, that when something's big and close and intense, I feel it strongly, like my gambling is intense, but that other thing is like small and tiny and far away. So actually not on the cognitive or emotional level, but on the visual level. So these are visualizations. I'm also certified in hypnosis, by the way. It's a whole different conversation. So I'm starting to switch and actually change the sizes of the images in my mind, or in the mind of the individual I'm working with. So another quick and simple way, but also that's why I spend so much time about the meaning and values, because the more we can help them to articulate, everything we get them to say out of their mouth is twice as valuable as mine. So as I get them to articulate the things that they want, it starts magnifying that to help to, again, offset.
And in my case, I'm taking a big swing here because I'm not a clinician at all, but I heard this concept called neuroplasticity. And it's this idea that your brain will begin to heal itself over time, and your pathways will begin to, reset. In fact, I think that you're the one that first used that term in my experience. But there's a guy at a GA meeting who said he used to watch the grass grow outside because that's all he had to do. He had no hobbies, nothing to do. And for him, it ended up working. When people ask me that question, I tell them to try doing the things that they used to have joy from, with the expectation that it will be less joyful at first.
So as I've already mentioned, that we know lots of research from training. You can see how I slide that research word in there. We have lots of research from training. That people go to these conferences, we go to trainings, and we learn all these cool things, and we go back and do the same thing on the next day. So I will invite you, I will challenge you to apply this now. What is one thing that you've learned today, and you can write this one down, one thing that you've learned today that you want to practice, that you want to do differently, a tool that you like, that you are going to try out with somebody on Monday. You got me? So that it's not just Ken doing his talk, Rob doing his talk, it's actually that these voices are helping us to grow through dozens and all the people that you serve on a daily basis in this often thankless work.
Well, thank you everyone for listening.